We are live.
Right. So hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us here. We're just waiting for everyone to enter the webinar before we get started. We're expecting to kick things off in about 2 minutes. Thanks. Okay, hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name is Mark Nerdy. I'm a communications officer with the City of Kingston, and I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar. So before we begin, we just have a few housekeeping items here. This webinar is hosted as part of the Municipal Innovation Week. And before we begin, just a note that this session will be live streamed on YouTube and it is going to be recorded. So you can catch this on the city's YouTube page as well. The video, microphone, and chat features have all been disabled for your privacy. If you do have a question, we'll address that later, but we can invite you to unmute yourself. And we also have a chat feature open. Please make sure that you are not at any point in time sharing any personal identifying information during this webinar. So that would be, names, addresses, contact information, etc. If you'd like to get in touch with anyone, you can send a chat message directly to our panelists, at which point we can connect you behind the scenes. We have two main ways of asking a question during this webinar. So the first is you can ask a question in writing using the Q&A, and you'll just see it on the Zoom navigation bar there. Click the Q&A button, and you can type in any questions there. Your name and question will be visible to everyone participating in the webinar. You can also ask a question verbally by using the raise hand feature. If you click raise hand, it'll come up on our participant pane on the side here. I can then invite you to unmute yourself, and you can go ahead and ask your questions to the participating individuals. On the off chance that we don't get to address any questions, we will have a log of them so we can connect after the fact as well. If you're having any technical problems, just call in at the number there and use the webinar ID indicated below there. So that we always recommend if you have a problem with your video, just leave the webinar and rejoin using that exact same link and it should work. Having said that, we're ready to begin with the webinar. So I'm going to pass things over to Joanna. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and wonderful to have this time with you and all of our guests and speakers today. My name is Jo Reynolds. I'm a Kingston resident and I work for the Center for Social Innovation, and I'm very glad to be working with the City of Kingston and our partners at Queen's to bring you the session today. But before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land and the privilege that we have to live on this land and work and play and raise our families. And the land acknowledgement honors the long-standing history of Indigenous peoples on this land. It is the beginning of a conversation about the work that needs to be done by each of us and Canada as a whole, and an opportunity to share our learnings and unlearnings. So we acknowledge that this sacred land on which we are today, that we're privileged to live and work and to farm and to raise our families, is a land that is known to the Mississauga Anishinaabe, or original peoples, as the Michi-Saugig-Nishnabeg territory. It is also referred to as a Northern Iroquois by the Huron and Haudenosaunee. And many of the descendants of the Michi-Saugig-Nishnabeg and Iroquois continue to live, work, and play on the lands and waters of their ancestors. Thank you. We can continue, please. I'd like to introduce Craig Desjardins, the City of Kingston.
Thank you very much, Jo, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of Municipal Innovation Week. We're incredibly grateful for your time and participation at today's exciting event, and more importantly, for sharing in the co-creation of the community investment discovery briefing that is the foundation of some amazing work. We're also looking forward to the upcoming design thinking session next week. As leading innovators in our community, you know that innovation comes in many forms and isn't just about technology. Process innovation perhaps holds the most promise for many of us. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's the critical importance of the social enterprise and the not-for-profit sector and the leading role it plays in our society. Today's discussion of examples of social finance, I think, is going to be critical as we move forward. As the office that oversees sourcing non-tax revenue, or grants primarily, the discussion of social finance models is extremely, extremely important. There is always more demand than supply for financial resources. I'll just close today by saying a special thank you to Lakshay and Joe for their leadership in this great initiative. Lakshay is one of our rising stars in the corporation and has done an amazing amount of work with Joe, and can't thank them enough for all of their efforts. I'll now, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Mayor Patterson, our community's innovation champion, to say a few words. Your worship.
Thanks very much, Craig, and good afternoon, everybody. It is a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second in our Municipal Innovation Lunch Series. It was a great presentation discussion yesterday, and looking forward to another great presentation discussion today. It's no secret I'm a big fan of innovation, and I'm a big fan of what all of you do each and every day to feed into that innovative energy and entrepreneurial spirit that we're continuing to build here in Kingston. I was actually thinking just earlier this morning about how it's basically been a year that we've been in this, whole new world of COVID. And I remember it was about a year ago, just right into the pandemic, that someone sent me a study from Stanford University on what it takes to not only survive a crisis, but to recover quickly and to ultimately rebuild from it. And there are basically a couple of things that were highlighted in that study. It's an ability for a community to adapt and innovate, and their ability to collaborate across different sectors to be able to work together to face challenges. And I think what I am so inspired about is that I think that Kingston is so well placed in both of those, our ability to innovate, our ability to collaborate. And I think that we have really shown great leadership through the last year, meeting the challenges of the pandemic. And now I look forward to showing that same leadership as we innovate and collaborate again, as we move out of that pandemic and on that road to economic and social recovery, being able to do some incredible things as a community. Innovation is not just as much as it's about economic development. It's really about how do we make our community better? How do we feed into an improved quality of life? How do we address some of those big social issues that we know that our community is facing, but quite frankly, are being faced by so many other communities across the province, the country, and beyond. And so I'm really excited about the sort of stuff we're going to be talking about today that can really, again, take that innovative energy and be able to do incredible things. Let's show the province, the nation, the world what we can do here in Kingston. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Big thank you to Joe and Lakshay and Craig, Amber in my office, everybody that's helped to facilitate this. And thank you for all of you for your time. And let's get going. Looking forward to the presentation today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson. Hi, everyone. Just by ways of introduction, my name is Catherine Lee, and I'm a consulting director on QS2I at Queen's. And so I'll just give everybody a little bit of a breakdown of what we have for today. So we're first going to give a brief synopsis of the Kingston Community Investment Project, and then transition to a great lineup of speakers who will really talk about their own experiences. So first we have Lars from Van City Community Investment Bank and Joshua from Parkdale Land Trust. Next, Julia from Harvest Impact will be speaking to us, followed by Keshav from the Kingston Social Value Fund, James from Verge Capital, and Michelle from Pillar Nonprofit Network. And finally, we'll end off with next steps in terms of a design session that will be happening on April 1st. So I'll pass it off to you, Joe, to talk about more about what we've been working on.
Super. Thanks so much, Catherine. We have had a privilege, if you could advance the slide, Mark, that'd be great. We're privileged to be able to share a little bit about what we've been working on for the last number of months. We've had wonderful conversations with community leaders and Catherine will get into that in more detail in the next slide, but just to let people know that Kingston Community Investment right now is in a discovery phase, a learning phase, and it's just an initiative being developed to assess and learn about community investment and its feasibility, its viability, and perhaps desirability of having an opportunity to explore community investment solutions in Kingston in the areas of housing, homelessness, and food security in particular. And Catherine?
Thanks. So if we go to the next slide. So the entire project really began in the discovery phase, where we first analyzed community data to identify the areas that might be a good fit for community investments and were experiencing the most impact due to COVID-19. So it was identified that homelessness, housing affordability, and food security were the three main pain points within the city. And so from there, the project team met with 15 Kingston residents who shared how COVID-19 has impacted their communities in these areas. And if you haven't already, I encourage everyone to read through the community investment brief, as it really provides a lot of great insights that we discovered through this phase. And next, I'll pass it off to Keshav to talk a little bit more about community investment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. And if you could just advance the slide. So community investment often goes by many names, like place-based investing, community capital, and social finance. But essentially what community investing looks to do is use repayable financing and investment to support the startup or growth of a community-based project or social enterprise. Community investment models are created in response to specific community needs, but it varies in terms of its approach. And the last thing I want to flag is that community investment works to complement grant making in the charitable sector with investment solutions that look to solve critical community needs.
Thanks, Keshav. If you could advance to the next slide, because it's now my honor to be able to introduce you Joshua Brunt, who is the Executive Director of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust in Toronto. It's a unique nonprofit community-based organization that acquires land for affordable housing, supportive housing, and community economic development. Joshua is an urban ecologist and community land trust practitioner, and he is here with Lars Bogold, is the Senior Manager of Banking and Investments with Van City Community Investment Bank. He oversees VCIB's direct funding relationships and portfolio while delivering new partnerships and programs to advance the bank's strategy to deepen access to capital for mission-driven organizations as part of their business banking and lending practices. Thanks so much for joining us today, Lars and Joshua, and we'll pass the mic over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Awesome.
And I'll just let you know that when we come close to the end of your time, I'll just jump in and flag and let you know of that.
Beautiful. Do you mind just advancing to the next slide? Yeah, so I'm here representing the Neighborhood Land Trust and the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. And I'm presenting from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And our organization, the Neighborhood Land Trust and the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, are a community land trust working out of the Parkdale neighborhood of Toronto. We exist to take ownership of land and housing to be held in community control and ownership and stewarded on behalf of the community. And we work to assure that the lands which we own are used specifically to provide community benefits to equity-seeking community members. Next slide, please. The slide you're seeing here is some images of our community and our members and the work we do. And what you'll see is that obviously we have a very active membership. As a community land trust, residents in the community can join and participate democratically in the work that we do and help to create housing solutions for our neighborhood and for our community members. Next slide. So the problem which we're going to discuss today is that over the last 10 years, market forces have been displacing tenants in rooming houses and small rental buildings, often into homelessness. As a neighborhood land trust, our impact strategy, our social impact focuses on preserving the rental housing stock as permanently affordable housing, which is a strategy to prevent homelessness for existing tenants and also to provide housing to people currently experiencing homelessness. In our rooming house acquisition and preservation strategy, we're seeking to support rooming house tenants and small building tenants who are currently in that housing to stay in that housing as permanent housing, but also to make space for people exiting homelessness. As a neighborhood land trust, we work to acquire and improve at-risk rooming houses and small buildings, and we lease these properties to qualified charitable housing organizations who will manage these buildings as permanently affordable housing with supports. Our goal through this impact model we'll present today is to secure the housing stability of these vulnerable tenants by acquiring at-risk properties in the market and transitioning them to nonprofit ownership and permanently affordable housing. Next slide. So here's an image of an article in the newspaper a number of years ago. We published a study on the rooming house stock, which proved that we had a crisis of rooming house loss. In the past 10 years, we had lost 28 rooming houses, which displaced over 350 tenants. And there were an additional 300 tenants at risk of losing their housing if their buildings sold to a certain type of predatory corporate landlord who had an interest in increasing their rents and pushing out long-term tenants. Next slide. We knew then and we know now that preserving and improving this low end of market rental housing is essential both to community wellness, but also to an equitable recovery from COVID-19. Obviously, the COVID-19 health crisis has highlighted the gaps in Toronto's shelter system and the urgent need for secure, safe, and affordable housing. We also know that there is a need for strategies for homeless prevention. On day one, tenants who are at risk of homelessness, on day one, when we take ownership of buildings, tenants who are at risk of homelessness will have secure, affordable housing and be safe from speculative evictions and rent increases. We also know that through acquisition of projects in comparison to construction of projects, we can provide quick start projects, which means that we might be able to bring a project forward in 2 to 6 months instead of 2 to 4 years. Of course, in the COVID context, where there's such an urgent need, we know that quick start projects are a dire need. We, however, have some big challenges when trying to acquire property in the open market. For one, nonprofit organizations lack the resources to self-finance acquisitions. In addition, government affordable housing programs and long-term financing alternatives cannot be accessed fast enough to support competitive acquisitions in the open market. So a number of years ago, we undertook failed project after failed projects, trying to line up the interest of a private owner with a government program and financing. We had 9 failed projects until we had a successful pilot. And most recently, we decided to partner with a financial institution to develop an impact investment model that could assist us to act quickly. Next slide. So this brought us into a relationship with Van City Community Investment Bank. And Lars will present a bit about Van City, but Van City is a social bank which has an interest in supporting organizations creating social good in their community, and also a commitment to supporting organizations who focus on community ownership and control. Next slide. So Lars, I'll invite you to present the model that we've developed together, the Preserve and Protect Guarantee Program.
Thanks very much, Josh, and pleased to be with you all, also calling in from Toronto. So as Josh shared, the critical kind of dynamics that the land trust was facing and that the market in both Toronto is facing, but which I think is probably also relevant in a context like Kingston, where there's both a demographic transition of older existing landlords and owners of some of these smaller rental buildings choosing to look to retire and divest of these existing portfolios. And often, and I know this is the case in many smaller centers, a lack of existing organizational capacity for new organizations to be building a lot of new housing at a scale required. So we know issues of homelessness and that kind of risk is true in smaller centers as well. And what we looked to do here in this model is really try to provide the land trust a mechanism through which it could acquire properties that are coming to sale on the open market in a more competitive process and stabilize them such that they could transition them through longer term financing programs. So some of the existing government funding programs, so things like the National Housing Strategy, more provincial funding strategies, or municipal funding strategies, have these longer term decision-making cycles. So In this program, what we have looked to do is raise some external investor capital that is being used as additional collateral to the bank to justify lending to the land trust as a bit of a bridge lender on a reasonably long term, on 3 years, to allow them to acquire properties in the open market, hold them, and in that holding period, apply for and successfully transition these properties to longer term funding programs. I think the one thing I'd mention that's really worth emphasizing, considering with our gratitude to the hosts in the city, is that in many ways, I think, Josh, it's fair to say, we're doing this program in some ways because of some existing policy failures. Existing funding programs don't have the quick start and decision-making timeframe to really work in this kind of context. Just next slide. Pleased to share that through the program, NLT has been able to secure an agreement of purchase and sale for a very strategic site that's actually adjacent to an existing property they own. This is a 36-unit building in Parkdale, which again is an example of one of these privately owned properties that have been able to provide lower cost rental housing locally, but which really would have been at risk of being sold into the open market, being upscaled and transitioned to much higher cost rental housing if left to open market forces. And so this program is facilitating the land trust, bringing this into more permanent community ownership for the long term. Next slide, please. Really pleased to say that we've reached 100% of our funding goal, but we really have only been able to do this with what I describe as kind of catalytic impact investors. So for this specific acquisition, over $8.4 million was required to both purchase a property, cover closing costs and financing costs during that holding period that I mentioned. The challenge is that there's a gap between what a bank, even a mission-driven bank like BCIB, can conventionally lend to this kind of asset, and what it will also just bear in terms of interest costs through its own cash flows. And so we created a structure where investors' funds are really being kind of leveraged by the bank to justify additional lending. So for every dollar that they invested in the program, $3.33 are generated in lending capacity from the bank to provide to the land trust. So there's a sharing of risk here between the bank's appetite and really kind of mission-driven impact investors who are willing to kind of step in and provide this backstopping guarantee to the bank to justify this type of targeted lending that's a bit unusual and not otherwise available in the market. Next slide.
Yeah, so I'll jump in here, Lars. I mean, I think our ultimate goal is to create permanently affordable housing for our community. And we know that stable housing is the base of so many people's good lives. We also know that as a community land trust focused on community ownership, that bringing properties into community ownership through the CLT represents an asset-based approach to build community wealth and resilience. And of course, in this moment of transition and reflection from COVID-19, moving forward, we need to be investing more strategically in solutions that will enable communities to be more resilient in the long run. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about our model, and we welcome any questions that you might have for us. And of course, you can always reach out to either of us at the emails presented at the beginning of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Joshua and Lars, for presenting such a fulsome and presentation of this relationship and where you're going. It's exciting to see. I'd like to open it up. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions and we do have one that came up. Michael Oster was wondering about the rise of tiny homes and what you've heard about that, and if you have any insights on that movement from your perspective.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We don't have much insight on the tiny home movement. Our analysis has been that the most economically efficient, quick start, and impactful means to provide affordable housing in our communities is to actually secure the existing rental housing that exists already within our stable neighborhoods. These are places which are close to services, where often residents who are low income are already living, but also which present an ongoing opportunity to be able to provide that affordable housing for others as units become vacant. And so, just to give you a comparison, in Toronto, to build a new affordable housing unit with land and construction costs, we're looking at, $300,000 to $500,000 per unit. To acquire a rental unit by acquiring existing rental, we're looking at costs of between 150 and 250, including renovations. And so it's a much more efficient approach, but also impactful in the sort of way that it supports existing community infrastructure and place-based approaches to being in community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the challenges for sure, we fully recognize that the same kind of economic picture that Josh described. And one of the challenges, unfortunately, is I think the private market does too, in some ways, and which is why they're looking to acquire these kinds of buildings. And there's a lot of strategies these days in expensive markets like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, where the strategy is acquire these existing buildings and try to raise the rents. And what we also recognize to Michael's question is that it is actually also very exciting that there has been more almost like building technology or construction technology innovation beginning to occur, and more prominent in some other countries, but starting to actually become more prominent in Canada. And so while in very justifiable that acquiring existing properties and pulling them into permanent affordable housing is the most kind of efficient mechanism, things like the growth in modular construction and development are also proving to show really significant cost savings relative to conventional or more traditional construction technologies. And so tiny homes are a good example kind of along that continuum, but it's almost always going to be better to build like multi-unit buildings as opposed to individual smaller homes. So for affordability specifically as the goal, I'd say those are more prominent and effective strategies. But certainly you can put more homes on one piece of land with tinier homes too.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that question, Michael. In terms of the community process, Joshua, I was wondering if you could speak to how you started to have this conversation with community members and what that was like.
Yeah, so our organization was actually created by 7 local existing nonprofits and resident associations that came together, who were all concerned about the increasing speculation on real estate in the market and how it was going to impact residents' access to resources like affordable housing or community space. And so they knew that we needed a real estate-based response, to a real estate problem. And so they proposed a community land trust, and we undertook 3 years of capacity building and community engagement to help us build an organization that's community controlled and community grounded. And we then spent 3 years piloting out our first few acquisition projects and developing ways to work with community to undertake development that's more equitable and community responsive. And I can say that the process that we found to be most productive is to begin with community planning and research. So to clearly identify what the real needs and the real situation are in the market. And part of that is what are residents experiencing and what they need based on their experiences, but also what is specifically happening in the submarket in your community, like the rooming house submarket or the mid-century rental submarket, and how are the market dynamics impacting tenants. And so we start with research, and through the research, we engage community members. We always involve people with lived experience of living in those homes. And then we will publish a public report making recommendations on how the community and the government can respond together. and we'll implement pilots to test the model and prove the financial models that we're proposing can work. And from a pilot, we always intend to develop, to scale up to programs. And so I think we have to think about scalable models that build the knowledge base from the community lens, but then take the solutions to a scalable, to a scale that can have real impact.
Thanks so much. That just being able to hear you talk about that process is helpful. And it's, of course, so important to start with the people whose lives are most affected and impacted. And Harold actually has a quick question around the range of ages of there's children or youth that are involved and engaged in this process and finding housing here.
Yeah, so in our buildings currently, we don't have families. They're mostly bachelors in one bedroom, so there's not currently families living in our housing. But we do have young people and youth involved in our community work more broadly, and we have a youth representative on our board to ensure that the youth voice is present in our sort of governance. So we do try to do that, and we hold a lot of community engagement events that seek to sort of bring a broad set of people into the room to have discussions. Yeah, so like it is important. There's I think always more work we need to do to bring young people into these conversations, because they're really the ones who are going to get the work done and bring forward like the most innovative work. Like I can't wait to see what you know the generations under us will be able to accomplish.
Yeah. Thanks so much. We have time for a couple more questions before we move on to Julia, our next speaker. James is interested in the time scales involved. Like how much in advance do you need to start fundraising to provide sufficient base for the NLT to fund and to begin purchasing and secure the relationship with VCIB?
Yeah, that's a great question.
If I could just add to that, like at what point in this process did you start that conversation with Lars and begin thinking about this as a strategy together? So
the Neighborhood Land Trust and Van City Community Investment Bank had a pre-existing relationship before we started working on this particular model. Van City had provided the mortgage for our pilot acquisition project, which was of a local rooming house, the building you see in the photo. So we had an existing relationship, but in fact, Lars and I sort of met at a conference, the Mars conference, and we were in the hallway, I think, and I was sort of presenting our challenge, like there's government programs, but they're not responsive. They don't act fast enough. We keep losing opportunities. We feel like we're failing our community. We need to find ways to get capital quicker to be able to be responsive to the realities of the market. And Lars just chimed in and said, I think I have an idea. And it took us about 4 months to sort of model out the idea and begin to pitch it to folks. We spent 3 months doing some soft pitches to foundations and investors who we thought would be most interested, and to get feedback before we sort of formalize the model. And then we actually spent 6 to 7 months pitching to organizations to reach our goal. So it was a lot of work. This is not for the faint of heart. It involves a lot of presenting your work over and over to investment committees. And our experience, and just for any of the community organizations interested in these types of models, is that you need to really anticipate a different type of approach taken from your investors than you would from your the staff who are supporting granting. Like the foundations and the impact investors, they're looking at this both for social impact, but also as a real investment. So their due diligence process is more rigorous compared to granting, where often there's an expectation that once they approve your proposal, they're happy with what you do and you just need to report. So there's a more rigorous process, and it takes a bit more time than sort of some of the traditional ways of raising money. Our hope is that as we prove the model, that that process will be shortened for others, because both the organizations, the bank, as well as the investors will have had an experience doing this, and will have more of a clear sort of like process to be able to be responsive. And I should say that we partnered with VCIB partly because we thought that there was a value in having a socially oriented bank model this out and potentially take it to other communities that could benefit from a similar model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just add to that briefly to say, like to kind of Josh's point, even in our context as a more kind of like motivated institutional partner, It's still unusual, frankly, for any organization to kind of like spend the developmental time on this kind of work in that kind of format. And so we've kind of been privileged to do so, I think, in part because of some of the trust that had been built with the land trust through things like that prior relationship, for sure. And fundamentally, like that, that experience that Josh described of like actively doing very community-based research to develop kind of pilot models to then seek programmatic scale is also like undoubtedly a major reason both for the bank's kind of trust in this work as well as the external investors. Like I have no doubt that for impact investors that were more kind of impact oriented, there's a recognition that community-based expertise has been built up in the land trust. I think the one other thing I'd mention just in terms of kind of lessons along the way around that is, we did end up for sure not only having like a fairly not necessarily overly long, but long enough kind of fundraising process, but also like one that definitely iterated a couple times. Like we went through, I think, a few different kind of models, tweaks to the model kind of along the way as it got exposed to investors and their preferences and needs. And so, one thing for sure that I think we're very thoughtful of as we think about replication is around the need for there definitely to be kind of like a kind of a central home or like backbone organization around even the kind of deal development or kind of fund development for these kind of initiatives, so that you can kind of hold a bit of a table for at least the kind of key partners that are there, so that everyone's kind of preferences are really being met and there's no kind of communication gaps. So we've definitely gotten to, I think, a really exciting and positive place with it, but I think the preconditions for that had been willingness to build that trust in partners, willingness to build up community expertise. For sure.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks so much. It's time for us to move on to our next guest. But Lars and Joshua, thanks so much for bringing your learnings and thoughts, and thanks as well for the questions in the Q&A. We're going to hold on to those questions because there'll be opportunities there for us to dig deeper into those questions in the next session. So I'm going to ask Catherine if you could come up and introduce us to Julia.
Perfect. Thank you, Joshua and Lars. It's really incredible work that the two of you are doing. So next we have Julia Grady, who is the executive director and co-founder of 10C, working with long-term community benefit as her core purpose. Julia has led 10C through a multi-million-dollar expansion and a building acquisition, which included the adaptive reuse of a more than 150-year-old property. She also championed Harvest Impact that we will hear about today. Harvest Impact is exploring the continuum of social investing from philanthropy to investing. So with that, Julia, I'll hand it off to you. And due to time, you have until 12:55, and I'll chime in a minute before to remind you.
Perfect. Thanks, Catherine. Just testing my mic. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So thanks to everyone. I love the segues of the things that you learned along the way and the readiness of the community and the ecosystem, and then also the extra diligence that all of these projects entail. If we could go to my slide, I basically have one slide that I'm going to speak about 3 different projects because it really pulls the story of where we started to what we thought might be possible and what we learned was possible, and then what we're building into for the future. So the Harvest Impact Fund is really a lot of our future work. And I'll preface about the past work that we did through 10C. So as Catherine introduced, I'm the ED of 10C Shared Space, which is a community hub in the city of Guelph, the city currently known as Guelph, and is on the traditional land of the Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples. Our work is right in the heart of downtown, and this is a place-based work has been my passion for the last 15 to 20 years, and it's now 10C's 12th year. 10C started in 2008 at the other economic collapse with a notion that people really needed to be working closer together, and we needed to build all kinds of shared resources and capacities. I think that we're at this point, we've been at this point for probably a couple decades, where there's a major imperative for not-for-profits and charities and purpose-driven organizations to bring new and innovative tools that social finance offers us really to the fore in our communities. So the 3 projects I'll talk about will, I hope, do some of that. And rather than extracting wealth, not-for-profits and the tools of social finance really offer us exciting methods to build community wealth and resilience. So as our not-for-profits, I think, face more pressures, I think there's also a ton of opportunities for us to really kind of grasp onto these. And not-for-profits in many ways are really well situated to capture the potential and power of social finance, especially with their direct connection to individuals' lives and work that is needed to make our communities stronger. So my 3 projects are kind of going to tell a bit of this story. So the first one, and on the left of the slide, is the past and also the present. So our first social finance project was 10C's Community Bond Investment Program, which is we raised $2.325 million in social financing specifically from impact investors. The second project is Harvest Impact, which is the new place-based fund and intermediary that will support businesses to transition to more circular food economy. And that is geared to provide at least $3 million in blended financing, a bit of grants, a bit of financing, and building out a fund that will exist after the scope of the project we're working on. And then a third project, which is really something any not-for-profit organization could almost implement tomorrow, is a donor-funded microlending program called the Nourish Helper Fund. And for us, that's a small fund with $7,500, but I'll go into that at the end of my kind of notes here. So in 2012, 10C was a small community hub. We had an $800 a month lease from a landlord, and we knew that we needed to grow and expand our model. By the first 3-4 years, 10C was too small to grow. Most of our revenue was from existing operations. We had no external funding, which was great because we had unrestricted revenue, which a lot of not-for-profits really struggle with, because fitting the pieces of your work together with different streams of grant funding is a very complex task. So we knew we needed to kind of shift the model, grow and scale, and build a long-term home for community enterprise. We also had zero capital. So we looked to what the Center for Social Innovation had achieved in their first community bond project. And I remember talking to Corinne at that time. She's like, "Oh, you could do this one tomorrow." And CSI by that point had already been well underway on their second project and had essentially open sourced the legal structure and a lot of the process. So the conceptual understanding of it was very clear. The work involved was astronomical. So I would highly do it again. There are more place-based projects that are happening. And I think now there are finally more people that we can talk to and share our stories and our challenges with. We also, at the same time, in 2012, 2013, we're preparing a grant application for the Ontario Trillium Foundation. And we received a small kind of seed grant, which was just $37,000. And that gave us like a window of time where we could work on a plan and a project that we could move forward. It also let us say in our out loud voices, we're going to buy and renovate real estate, which in hindsight was one of the key pieces that actually let us move forward. And what we ended up achieving was, the picture of 10C's building, it's a 15,000 square foot landmark building right in the core of our city. It's has 2 street fronts. It provides a home for 200 organizations. It's great. We've made it fully accessible, and it was formerly for the past 100 years had been a a furniture store. So it had 2 people in it at any given time, and now was transformed into like a 4,000% factor of just human occupancy and active use. It was a $5 million project that was financed in real time. The Parkdale Land Trust model is really interesting in that the timing of this and the ability of not-for-profits to really quickly implement is a massive challenge. So I would look forward to different methods that projects like these can take on in the future. Since we took the project on, we basically, in the span of 2015 to 2017, brought in most of our financing, and then that gave us similar time to kind of build our membership model and our revenue model. So we grew from 60 members to over 200. All of our members aligned their work to the Sustainable Development Goals. We shifted the land use density from 2 employees to 50 to 100. And now pre-COVID and post-COVID will be one of the busiest locations in downtown Guelph. Our structure, very similar exactly to CSI's community bond model, has a first mortgage lending, and that's from VCIB. And VCIB, as far as a financial institution, really walked alongside of us. We were their first real estate project in the early stages of Van City implementing VCIB. And I'm sure that we both have mutual stresses in that process. It was there was a lot of like lessons and learning, and I think 10C is in many ways is still building capacity to be able to effectively and long-term steward the real estate and that property and project. But in the program, we basically tore apart a 150-year-old building, rebuilt it up brand new, and brought our investors along on the entire journey. So when we were excavating the basement, which took 3 months, we were doing community bond presentations there. And all the way along, our investors were there to support the notion that this could happen. So there's a willingness in community to lean into some of the risk that is new and different that I think some of these projects can kind of capture. I think all of this work is balancing impact and risk, and there are different and new ways. We had the community bond structure offers a flexible and democratic structure, so it's open to all types of investors. Our bond program had $1,000 tiers to $150,000, and our average is about $17,000 invested across 140 individuals. And the individuals include individuals, foundations, organizations, businesses, and then also the University of Guelph. In 2018, we've did a third-party survey with Terrapin Social Finance, and there's like an emerging field of data and surveys around like high net worth investors and what their preferences are. But we wanted to really hear from our investors at that point in time. We had just barely finished the renovation. We're just getting ready for what our next steps of work would be, and this is what we heard. That out of the 73 of the 130 investors responded, we learned some kind of tools and ideas that you could apply to projects you might be considering. So on our project, 87% of investors were from the community, 58% of the investors identify as female, about 66% have incomes of less than $100,000, and 12% have incomes of over $200,000. About 80% of our market in our investors have university or graduate degrees, and then some have high school only. 2/3 of our investors said that direct impact investing is part of their overall strategy, and that they're considering, 60% of them are considering annually placing $10,000 a year into direct impact investing, and another 20% are considering placing upwards of $25,000, with some investors selecting that they may want to continue to invest upwards of $50,000 annually. And their number one question for me was, after 10C's project, what else should I or could I be looking at investing in? So there is a willingness for like direct investment and building community. In the 2016 to 21 phase, so rates. So we're just in a community bond renewal phase right now. And at the time in 2016, the kind of appropriate rates of return were 2.5% to 4 or 5%. Our maximum rate was 5%, and then our current maximum rate on our current community bonds will be about 4%. So we'll go from 2.5% to 4%. Our project services interest and principal on our first mortgage. And then on the community bonds, we're servicing interest only for the next couple of years. And the program will rely on new investors to flow in to replace any exiting investors. And people have the ability to flow in and out at basically the beginning and ends of their terms. I think this is fairly common to other programs because the second mortgage structure is meant to be long-term financing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be long-term financing by the same individual for the next 10 or 15 years. It can be, it can have that kind of flow. A lot of our investors saw the funds they're putting in as essentially stale capital. They liked that it had community impact, and they also liked that the rates were fairly competitive with anything else that was backed. So our story was always, well, the exit strategy, similar to the land trust, was that if you're not able to pull in investors or the project doesn't work, you sell the building and things continue on. That's obviously not our best case scenario at all, but it is the risk backing. And I think all of these funds need to consider what risk backing looks like. So we're continually dynamically adding to the project. Since the course of the initial development, we added commercial kitchen. We're looking forward to other future things. And over time, that'll build more stability and less risks for investors. We kind of take that whole bucket of learning and bring it into the Harvest Impact Fund, which is in relationship to the work happening in Guelph Wellington for our food future, which is a multi-stakeholder ecosystem who's aligning in many exciting ways to build a circular food economy. Our food future is inspired by planet's natural cycles, believing that a circular food economy can reimagine and regenerate the systems, eliminating waste, sharing economic prosperity, and nourishing our communities. It's a bit of an irony in Guelph Wellington. We're surrounded by food, but people don't have enough food to eat. And we also know that there's in the entire food system, there's 50% of our food is essentially lost in the system. We think we can change that. And we also think that it'll be a mix of business and not-for-profit sector coming together to make those changes. What we're working on is establishing Harvest Impact Fund to basically invest in those businesses. We're building a community capital institution, and we've landed on structuring that as a share capital co-op to enable both investors and investees to participate in the structure. We've got lots of collaborators, partners, and then essentially between 2021, where we're at right now is formally incorporating as Harvest Impact Fund Cooperative Inc. and working within the co-op models, 3 exclusions, which let you essentially prototype. We have 2 kind of choices. We could spend 5 years building out all of the conceptual structure, or we could spend a year or so building that out and then prototyping with actual businesses, actual lending, actual investors. And that basically is our pathway forward. So we will, by the end of this year, have, it'll be blended funding and financing. So we have a mix of about $1 million in upcoming invested funds, and then some blended in granted funds that will support organizations to develop business models. And all of this will be lent funds that basically live within the cycle of the fund that we're establishing.
Sorry, Julia, I don't mean to interrupt, just 1 minute.
Yeah, I know. And then my last little one here is the Nourish Helper Fund. So it's basically the $7,500 piece. and it's a donor supported fund. So it basically, we're working with Kindred Credit Union on this. You could set this up within your organization, but we really wanted, it's meant to support people who really have had no financing ever and or aren't even in the financial system. So having a credit rating with a financial institution at an individual level makes total sense. So we basically put funds in trust. Individuals building small micro food-based businesses can access up to $2,500 as a loan. And then that small little circle can build and support community over time. I think we're at like this really exciting phase in the ecosystem where organizations are really working together. And I'm really excited for everything that social finance can offer. I think I'm good. I had a lot of things I wanted to go through, but I'm happy actually for questions.
Thank you. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we don't have time for questions at this time. But if anybody does have any questions that they would like to ask Julia, we'd be happy to pass those along. So thank you again, Julia, for what you contributed. And now we're going to move on to Keshav. So Keshav is the fund manager of the Kingston Social Value Fund. And in addition to KSVF, he's also the consulting director on QS2I, where he leads a team of analysts on pro bono consulting engagements for SPOs, governments, and corporations on sustainability and social finance matters. So I'll turn it over to you, Keshav, and you have until 1:10.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine, for the introduction, and pleasure to be here with all of you today. So if we could just advance the slide. I'm excited to be here talking today about the Kingston Social Value Fund. And if you could just advance the slide. What KSVF is Kingston's first youth-led impact investment organization, and currently Kingston's only impact investment organization. But we're hoping to change that. If you could advance to the next slide. The reason that KSVF started was because we realized that Kingston requires new financing models to properly support social purpose organizations. And so what we saw was that the demand from these social purpose organizations for capital that was impact first was far exceeding the supply. And so when the federal government released this, this pool of investment readiness funds, this $8 million pool, they got $85 million of funding applications. So the fund was oversubscribed by 10 times. And so when we were doing some of the learning and discovery work here in Kingston and engaging with community and stakeholders, we saw that there are really viable social enterprises and social purpose organizations in Kingston, but we needed to create a structure that could unlock additional private capital to invest in these social purpose organizations to really help Kingston be a thriving and resilient and innovative community. And especially in the wake of COVID-19, I think we all saw that the cracks in the system that had always existed just became even more pressing and even more to the fore in the COVID-19 crisis. And what we saw is that, the broad majority of Canadians expect Canada to become more socially focused. There's an appetite for societal transformation, and Canadians realize we need to do something to reduce inequality in Canada. And so if you could move to the next slide, that's where the Kingston Social Value Fund comes in. Our purpose is to connect local social purpose organizations and community investors. And how we do that is threefold. First, our team works to identify social purpose organizations in Kingston that have high impact and ability to address critical community needs here. Our team then completes research, due diligence, and structures deals for the most in need and viable SPOs. And we do this alongside our investment committee, which helps to validate the opportunities. Once they've gone through our process, we then connect investment opportunities to local funders or invest directly through our own foundation. And if you could advance to the next slide. We do this investing using what we call the social value methodology, and that's kind of built on three core tenets: stewardship, impact adjusted returns, and inclusivity. On the first, about stewardship, what that means is that our investment model prioritizes a venture's ability to contribute to social and environmental solutions, not their financial profitability. So it doesn't mean that we're investing in unprofitable solutions, but what we believe is that by putting impact creation on the forefront rather than on the back burner, we're investing in fundamentally sound, strong, and resilient businesses. And our purpose as a fund is to incentivize those returns. And so we take what's called an impact adjusted returns model. That means that we'll purposefully incentivize ventures to create more impact at the cost of financial return. And that's not necessarily in all cases, but that does exist in many cases, and we have the appetite to do that. So I like to give the example, if we're looking at two companies, one is a unicorn, that could have a 10x return, but doesn't really do anything to contribute to social and environmental solutions. And then we've got a zebra that might be, a 2 or 3x return, but does contribute meaningfully to social and environmental solutions. Our fund will invest in the zebra all day and night long over the unicorn. And the last tenet is inclusivity. So we realize the range of community actors looking to address community issues is really wide, and it includes small and medium-sized enterprises, enterprising nonprofits, cooperatives, early stage social ventures, community contribution companies, and more. And so the KSVF model was crafted to be able to help finance and invest in all of these solutions. And if you can move to the next slide, we don't do this alone. We're supported by a variety of national organizations to leverage and increase our impact here in Kingston. The first is called the National Social Value Fund. So the National Social Value Fund is our parent nonprofit that provides year-over-year learning support and continuity for our social value fund. Now, there are actually 5 social value funds across the country in Vancouver, Calgary, London, Kingston, and Montreal. And NSVF provides us with the connectivity and support required so that we can leverage insights and learnings from across the country. Additionally, in partnership with the Social Innovation Academy, they operate the SVF Associate Program, where our team receives tailored social finance curriculum, impact investor training, as well as personal and professional development opportunities to increase our ability to execute on our local mission. SIA also delivers value to our investee companies through their network of student fellows who can provide our investee companies with pro bono consulting support. They also have access to a network of expert service providers who can provide investee companies with professional support on branding, legal, and accounting at low to no cost, because we realize it's so important to work to build capacity in the system as well. And we're also supported by the Canvas Social Value Foundation, which allows us to accept donor capital and invest in Kingston-based SPOs from the foundation's endowment. If you move to the next slide, we've got a brief case study to help illustrate our model. And this is the Vancouver Social Value Fund's investment in Clean Start. Clean Start provides junk removal and pest control services to their clients, who are typically BC community housing projects. Their primary social impact is the fact that Clean Start focuses on hiring people with barriers to traditional employment, including racialized individuals, newcomers, and women. After performing extensive analysis and due diligence, VSVF invested $85,000 in Clean Start to fund their expansion, and through SIA, Clean Start has been supported on 3 different projects post-investment. One of the interesting things about this deal was that VSVF invested using an impact-adjusted loan, whereby the interest rate on the loan decreased as Clean Start hired more individuals with barriers to employment and more women. And so the value of the Social Value Fund is really highlighted because Clean Start was intentionally incentivized to create greater impact, and they're a deal that might otherwise go unnoticed due to low return potential, despite having a fundamentally sound business model. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see the ways in which if you could just flip to the next slide. You'll see in the different ways in which local investors can support Kingston-based SPOs. It's really 2 different ways. The first is charitable donations. So individuals donate to the Canvas Foundation KSVF account. KSVF then invests 100% of that capital according to our mandate in Kingston-based social purpose organizations, and the investment returns are evergreen. So as capital is returned to us from investments, it gets redeployed and reinvested into the Kingston ecosystem. The second and third ways are more of a case-by-case investment solution. So what KSVF does is essentially act as a financial advisor. We go out, we find social purpose organizations, complete the research and due diligence, structure the deal. We'll then bring that to a community-based investor, and they invest directly either through equity or debt. And then KSVF helps to manage and support the investment post process. And so, if you flip to the next slide, you can see that we're an entirely student-led team of Queen's students from all different faculties, and really, despite all of our different curricular interests, we're all united under this cause of helping make Kingston a more resilient and thriving community, which I think is unique to Queen's students who don't typically get to engage with community. And we're supported by an investment committee and advisors that really draws from all aspects of community engagement, traditional finance, venture investing, as well as community support. And so if you flip to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about our progress. We've been around for about 16 months, but the majority of that time was spent engaging with community to figure out how we could build a solution that was best for Kingston. And so in the last little bit, we've seen that the social value fund model has been validated out in Vancouver, where they've made 7 local investments totaling over $400,000. 6 of those investments are on track with repayment, and 1 of them has already exited. And as we engaged with the Kingston ecosystem, whether it be foundations like the Community Foundation or United Way, nonprofits like Homebase, KEDCO, the city, and innovators like DDQIC and Launch Lab, we understood how we could best fit into the Kingston ecosystem. And so more recently, we've turned our focus to raising capital and engaging with social enterprises. We're very proud to announce that we have secured our first investor, the United Way, Kingston, Frontenac, Lennox, and Addington, and we're actively engaging with new potential investors. KSVF is also engaged with over 30 social enterprises in the KFLNA region and is actively pursuing due diligence on 2 different social purpose organizations. And if you flip to the next slide, our goal in the next 12 months is to raise $500,000 in local impact investor commitments. The fund looks to be about $1 million when all is said and done. Our goal is to make 3 to 4 investments in a year across different financial instruments, whether that be debt, equity, or hybrids. Our target investment size is about 25 to 70,000. So right in between kind of that micro loan and that large scale funding. And our portfolio, when all is said and done, looks to be about 8 to 12 investments. And so if you just flip to the next slide, we're really excited to be working in community and gaining traction around our initiative, and happy to get in contact with anybody who wants to support our initiative further. Thank you, and I'd love to take some questions.
I'll jump in. Thanks, Keshav, so much for bringing the Kingston Social Value Fund to our attention today. And it was a great presentation. We do have time for, we have 3 minutes time for a question. And I'm just going to, okay, I'm just checking to make sure to see if we have any questions specifically for you. And so if anyone has a question, you can pop it in to the Q&A specifically for Keshav. But Keshav, I just want to ask, when you were designing the fund, what kind of conversations did you have? How did you develop your impact thesis, and how did you develop how did you know you were going in the right direction? Who did you check in with, and what was that consultation process like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So when we were designing our fund is sector agnostic, which means we'll invest in all kinds of sectors as long as we see meaningful and tangible local impact. But we consulted with a lot of charities and nonprofits and the city to really understand where the core issues were. And we identified 3 key issues in the city. First was around homelessness, and particularly youth, female, and Indigenous homelessness. We also realized that there's a lot of issues around housing affordability, particularly housing that's close to central services and is available for transient individuals. And the last is around mental health and addiction. And so we did that by checking in with the folks at the United Way, like Bhavna, and folks at the Community Foundation, like Rob, as well as the city and Craig, and so many other community organizations to understand where we need to prioritize funding, but also be reflexive to community needs as they grow and change. Because if we want to build a solution that's going to be here in Kingston, not for 1 or 2 years, but for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, we need to make sure we can respond to community needs as they grow and adapt.
Super. And just very quickly, so thanks for that. Just very quickly, a question from Michael. Can you just remind us the difference between an SPO and a social enterprise, and where would each fit into Kingston's ecosystem? But you have less than a minute to answer that question.
No worries. Thanks for the question, Michael. So social purpose organization is just a more broadly encompassing term to address nonprofits that may have a social entrepreneurship capacity, social enterprises, cooperatives, and all of those kind of early stage social ventures. So any kind of corporate structure that looks to address social issues, but may have capacity to repay whether an equity, debt, or hybrid investment.
Okay, thanks. We do have another question, but I'm going to ask Keshav if you would go to the Q&A and type in an answer for James.
Happy to. I'm looking.
Okay, thanks so much. It's my pleasure now to introduce Michelle Baldwin. Thanks so much, Michelle, for joining us today. Michelle is the outgoing executive director of the Pillar Nonprofit Network in London, Ontario, where she founded and collaborated to create Innovation Works, which is their co-working space. It's a shared space for social innovators, and also Verge Capital that we'll hear a bit about today. It's a social finance program for Southwestern Ontario. She's currently a senior advisor transformation with the Community Foundations of Canada and the chair of the Ontario Nonprofit Network board, as well as vice chair of the Althosa Family Healing Services Board. So Michelle, it's my pleasure, to have a bit of time with you today. I know you were right at the beginning of Verge Capital. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit, just what is Verge Capital, but one of the things, because we're just at the beginning of learning and having these conversations in Kingston, can you give us a sense of, how did you come around together as a community to think about this?
Sure. Well, great to be here, Joe, with everybody, and excited to be with all the amazing co-creators of around social finance in Ontario and beyond. So back when we started to explore how do you build a social enterprise ecosystem, we were kind of coming at it from the perspective of you have the capacity building or supports that are needed for social enterprise, the marketplace that is needed, and the access to capital. So we kind of tried to tackle the capacity building first, and it became apparent pretty quickly that the access to capital was really important. And so a group of people, Lena Bowden, who wasn't able to be here today, but she's been a fierce advocate for social finance in London and region and across the country. She worked with some others to do an environmental scan that showed there was $40 billion in investable assets in and around our community. And if we could leverage even just a bit of that from the perspective of local investment for local impact, what would that mean for our community? And so that environmental scan, actually, like that number was something that got the attention of a lot of people. We brought together a group led by Dr. Juana Bronzai at Ivy, and lots of different people in our cross-sector approach in that room to dream up, like, what would a social finance framework look like for our community? And at first it was called Social Finance London. Fast forward to today, Verge Capital is a social finance intermediary that serves Southwestern Ontario. And we've really seen our approach as iterative, collaborative, trying to use a network approach. We've made mistakes along the way, for sure. And so today what we have is a program of Pillar Nonprofit Network, who's backboning it. But our partners from the early days were the United Way, Libro Credit Union, Sisters of St. Joseph, the Government of Ontario, who provided First Loss Capital, and of course SVX, who continues to be an extraordinary partner today. And so right now we have a startup fund that gives loans of $5,000 to $50,000 for social enterprises. And that was our starting point. Libro Credit Union provides some of that matching capital. So we provide 75% and they provide 25%, and they do a lot of the due diligence. So I can get into more of those details. Our breakthrough fund was, kind of a, what would you call it, a prototype moment with SVX. So we needed to create a separate legal structure, and it provides loans of up to $50,000 to $500,000. I think I have that right. I better double check my number for social enterprises that are in growth, community real estate, and affordable housing. And London Community Foundation has been a key partner in all of this as well. And they lead the way on any due diligence around affordable housing. So in our early days, we were using the framework of collective impact as a kind of our guide. And what's been cool to see is just how embedded social finance impact investing is in our community foundation. It is in our credit union, and how we're starting to see, some of that ecosystem even in our own community, where it's becoming really quite common. And maybe my last comment would be, with Innovation Works, we tested a community bond, which I knew you heard a bit about community bonds. And it was a huge public relations moment for Innovation Works with 47 investors, and we just renewed it with I think 77 this time around, which shows the growth of understanding around this work.
Thank you so much. That's a great overview. I remember being at that first meeting actually in London. I think Adam Spence from SVX and I came down.
That's right.
Be in the room, and it was really exciting. I'm pleased, anyone who has a question for Michelle, you're welcome to add it into the Q&A. Michelle, I wanted to ask you, when we start off in community with a desire to work together collaboratively, there are so many needs and so many interesting directions that you can go in. I remember being in that room, and I remember, the whole variety of different people who were there that day. And it was over 10 years ago, that conversation. And what's your sense of, how do you hold space for all the different directions that a community initiative could go in, knowing that you need to focus sometimes on just choose one or two things to just try and start to begin with? What kind of sense could you share with us in your experience?
Sure. Well, I think, it's always like any collaboration, I suppose, starting with a shared vision of what you're trying to accomplish. And maybe the other part that I would say is that there were offshoots around social finance and impact investing that the partners also were doing. And so how do you keep that shared communication across those collaborative partners, so that you may have the shared vision of what we were doing under Verge, but then if London Community Foundation is really going deep around affordable housing, or Libero Credit Union is looking at their own products, how are we trying to make sure that we're all, kind of sharing that communication? So I think that's been, something we've been trying to make sure that we do a good job on along the way. But that was where, it was kind of like, it doesn't have to, if I'm being honest, I think at the beginning we thought it would all be around this shared brand of Verge Capital, but it wasn't really a realistic perspective. I think if we really want to see social finance and impact investing get the kind of traction we're talking about, then we need to be seeing it in different ways in multiple organizations, even in our own communities. And how can we, kind of shift our competitive mindset to an abundance mindset?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're looking back, so first of all, I just want to say, thank you. I think it's that shared vision and good communication are definitely the pillars for a healthy process. And when you look back at over the last 10 years in that time, what do you see now as some of the lessons that you learned along the way with Verge?
Yeah, I think it is about being iterative and knowing that where you started isn't necessarily going to be exactly where you are. You have to have brave conversations when you do start to find yourself like kind of nudging up against others. What I've learned is that media, so storytelling and impact is so critical, but when we've used mainstream media, often they don't portray collaboratives all that clearly. And so for us, Verge Capital sometimes can be associated maybe too closely with Pillar Nonprofit Network. And really we want the spirit of it to be collaborative. So that has caused some, work that even outside of Verge, we're trying to think like, how can we really influence the media to be able to tell that story so that we're able to do that. Right now, so the Breakthrough Fund was about engaging investors into this moment rather than just the first loss capital that we might have put towards it through the Ontario government back when that was possible. And I think we thought that everybody was going to be really tripped up on the rate of return. And while that is an important part of the conversation, I call it maybe the first ripple of investors that were a part of the early days, the social impact, the environmental impact were primary drivers for their decisions, with the economic impact being important, but not the full driver, which I think I was likely, or we were surprised about. And then maybe my last lesson would be that, we have worked hard to think about equity inclusion at Pillar and within Verge Capital, but even with that lens, we have our own biases and perspectives, and having to question, are we creating some of the same structures, whether it's the application processes, the intakes, the review, really trying to make sure you take an anti-racism, anti-oppression lens to that work, and how are we sharing capital in ways that are really inclusive. And I think we still have more work to do on that front, for sure. We had an amazing group of summer students last year that went through and we kind of rebuilt out how can people interact with Verge so that it's more like a, what would you call it? You come to the store and you see everything, rather than having to figure out, where do I fit in this product, this product, this product. And they were the ones that just brought an incredible perspective to this anti-racism, anti-oppression, and what we could be doing, and asked some really good questions.
Those are really great questions to ask, because if we make space for asking those questions, it just opens up possibility for doing things differently or outside of what we might have be ways that we're used to, and always opens up opportunities. So I'm really glad that you brought that forward. I'll just have one more question, and then I'm going to ask if all the speakers who are still here, if you could just open up in a moment, if you could just open up your video, and then that way we can have, if there's any other lingering questions that people didn't get a chance to ask, we'll have a few minutes just to follow up, because I know it's been a really packed hour and a half. But Michelle, I was just wondering, when you started to think about investors, and we have, because we're also in places of high need, and donors, and were people ever concerned that if we opened up investment opportunities that people might lose their donor base for donations to community initiatives? Because that's something that comes up and is an important one to address, and to make sure it's built into the vision or values or principles of these types of products together.
I think it's a really important question you're asking, Joe. And I remember Ivy has an Ivy Impact Day, and we had a case study, conversation, and that question came up actually from some of the students, and whether or not we were maybe diluting where people will give their money, or just how will this impact philanthropy? And in the first iteration of our community bond at Innovation Works, we did see, and I think the total of the $1 million, so we raised $1 million for community bond and 2.2 in donations and grants, and we had about $200,000 that we thought was being directed to the donations and grants that actually came out, that people actually rerouted to the community bond, even after lots of discussion. So it does happen. And part of it is trying to educate on the difference. And we've had comments before when we've gone for grants or opportunities with those who have invested of, well, we have, given to you in this way. And so I think there is still work to do to help, educate and see that it's an and there's Lawson Foundation, for example, has done both with us. And I think they are a great example of trying to experiment with how can we both invest and grant and help to make that distinction for their board and for their teams.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. There is one other question, and I think, Melanie, Melanie Robb asked the question: what are some of the ways your organizations measure impact as part of your social finance process? And I'll just open that to to, to you, Michelle, but to Julia or Lars, Keshav or Joshua, any of our speakers. We have a couple of minutes left. We have 6 minutes, and we have we have about 5 minutes for conversation, and I have 1 minute of wrap up probably before we end today. But I think that's a great question, and if anyone wants to jump in on how do you measure, how do your organizations measure impact as part of your social finance process, that would be great to hear.
Lars, you go ahead. You look like you're ready, and I can jump in after.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, for us, it's a process that we really try to tie fairly closely to the sectors in which we operate. So for us, there's really kind of 3 broad buckets of activity. We do a lot of work in social purpose real estate, like the kind of programs that have been described, some here. We do a lot of work in clean energy and energy efficiency, and we do a lot of work in kind of broader social enterprise lending. And so for us in that context, what we've tried to do is really make our kind of like impact due diligence and measurement processes really tied to those areas and really kind of context specific. So what that means is that we're kind of getting to a point where there's pretty robust kind of internal rating tools through which every time we're underwriting a loan, we'll look at that alongside financial due diligence. And then there's a fairly kind of limited menu of kind of metrics to also support more of a kind of a quantitative roll up across our portfolio of activity. So in a place like social purpose real estate, it's a bit easier because it's things like square feet or units of affordable housing. Clean energy, likewise, there's more obvious figures like kilowatts of clean energy, things like that. And then in social enterprise lending, it's obviously much more varied, and so we tend to allow some of that to be more borrower driven, while still kind of tied to the relevant subsectors. So local sustainable food is a good area where there can be some kind of common pillars, but we tend to be not too determinative of that for borrowers. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Julia or Michelle, Keshav, any other responses?
Well, maybe
Okay,
Lars,
Michelle, then Julia. Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead.
It would be that in addition to some of the ideas Lars has shared, we've been looking at the SDGs as an example. And I guess just being transparent, I think what we've been doing is we've been saying like which SDG do these connect to, but we haven't done the depth of the measurement side of it. So I think that's like a to be continued piece that is a missing piece in our work at Verge.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Julia, I noticed that you had something to say. You just had to take yourself off mute.
Thanks. I think definitely impact measurement for the organizations as well as any kind of intermediaries is a core kind of piece of work. How we're going to handle it at Harvest is basically working with the enterprises to establish their KPIs, and then we basically have a view to what the project wants to achieve in general, and then we'll align those in a data system that can kind of pull it from our members versus having to go through a fairly onerous impact measurement process. So I think the notion of, and all of those then will align into the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So I think it's a really good question, and it's the other half of the financial question is really impact. So a lot of the work has to really move ahead.
Thanks. And Keshav.
I'm happy to jump in because I think at KSVF we take a mixed approach between kind of Julia's method and Lars's method, which is at the beginning stage, we run ventures through an impact triage tool, which is basically just to assess whether we see the impact that they create as core to their business, so it can't go away in downturn, and whether it's local. And so after it's past that stage, we identify the core areas of impact because it's sector agnostic. And so it's much more varied what the impact could be. It could be in clean tech, it could be in sustainable food, it could be in rural economic development, whatever that is. So we identify those core areas and establish KPIs, similar to what Julia mentioned. We then, once we're proceeding into due diligence on the deal, we've developed an impact due diligence tool built upon the IMP framework, the impact management project, that's been customized for our local context. And then following that post-investment, We usually look to work in those core impact KPIs into the financing mechanism, and we look to track that on a quarterly and annual basis with the venture. And we do take a mix of kind of qualitative and quantitative measurement.
Okay, thanks. Really, comprehensive answers. Thanks so much. We're wrapping up now. Mark, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. I just want to say thank you to Michelle, Julia, Lars, Keshav, and Joshua. I know this was a quick look at everybody's wonderful work that you're doing, but now I feel like we all know you and you're not that far away. And so if we decide to roll along this journey here in Kingston further, we know where to go to tap on your shoulders. So thanks for sharing and being open. And it's exciting to see a Kingston initiative here with the Kingston Social Value Fund. I also want to thank Mayor Brian Patterson for joining us today and being with us throughout the call, as well as Craig Desjardins for inviting us to do this work together. Thank you, Brian. And my colleagues, Lakshay, Keshav, and Catherine, we've been working together since September on this process, and it's been a really rewarding one. Our next step for people, April the 1st, at the same time between 12 and 1:30, we're doing a design session. And James McClellan is joining us to help facilitate. He's on the call today as well. You're welcome to say hi, James. This is for us an opportunity for us to think about what have we heard and what would fit for Kingston. If this might not be the right time, or maybe there is. I think there's some really interesting initiatives happening in Kingston, and perhaps this is a chance for us to explore some of those shared visions, some of the ways we want to communicate and continue learning. So on April 1st, it's going to be all about us. It's going to be very interactive and a chance for us to share back what we're feeling and thinking about and bring all considerations forward. So we hope that you can join us. If you're interested in joining, you can please advance the slide. You can email Lakshay, and Lakshay will make sure that you get an invitation, a calendar invite to come. And that's all. Thank you very much, everybody. Wonderful to see you all today. Enjoy the rest of your day.